Greetings, friends. The bad news is I got pneumonia, unrelated to COVID-19, just regular old pneumonia, so I've fallen behind on my editing. The good news, nay, wonderful news, is that in looking at everything that Patrick and I recorded, hours and hours of content, I realized there's not 3 but 4 episodes here. So this is now episode 2 of 4, and the previous episode is now 1 of 4. I will try to finish everything else as quickly as I can, have it up by the middle of February. Until then, please enjoy part 2.
Speaking of which, we should probably talk about the Polonias.
Yeah.
The Polonias were Mark Polonia, John Polonia, and their friend Todd Smith, who made Hallucinations from 1986. Hallucinations. Okay, so we were talking about the idea of movies that were just sort of like, oh yeah, these were just made by like weird dirtbag horror teenagers who wanted to make their own, who saw Evil Dead and were like, yes, I could do that. They hear, you hear enough stories about Sam Raimi just going out to a cabin in Tennessee and just sort of coming up with inventive ways of getting around their lack of funds. And you're just like, hey, I have a lack of funds and I'm creative. So yeah. So I feel like a lot of people went on to sort of imitate Evil Dead or make these sort of Evil Dead imitations. And this is definitely one of those. The thing that makes this movie and their other movie that we'll be talking about a little later, Splatter Farm, so unusual and so captivating is that they are the stars of the movie as well, and including Todd Smith. The 3 directors are also the stars of the movie. In this movie, I think they're the only people on camera. They are like 15, 16 years old. They are skinny. The Polonias are skinny, like twerpy looking weirdos. They have the absolute worst mustaches any human being has ever had. Just these really gross, thin mustaches, but like identical. I think they're identical twins, but I don't know it for sure.
Yeah.
But they look identical to the point where you watch this movie. They have the same glasses, the same bad mustaches, the same haircuts. You look at this movie and you often forget which character you're looking at. And they both have these like whining kind of voices. And it is so disarming. It is so strange to put yourself front and center and not try to be anything other than yourself. Like no one sets out to make a horror movie and is like, and then the heroes should be this. This is clearly like 2 brothers who were just like, let's just play ourselves and be ourselves in it. And it's clearly shot in their home. It looks like it was made like during a sleepover or several sleepovers. Like it has this real, just sort of like, we'll make it up as we go along kind of feel. And it's also got this really interesting like latchkey kid kind of vibe, because it's got this story about these kids who they're having the sleepover because their mom is like has to work late, and there's like several scenes where they wake up to find a note from their mom being like, sorry, I had to go do a double shift or whatever. And so they're kind of just like left to their own devices. And the one brother, and this is the part where it's like, I don't know the Polonia's history. And these movies, they like to push the buttons. They like to be offensive and just sort of weird and gross in many different ways, especially Splatter Farm, which we'll be talking about later. But this as well. So there is this implication in this movie that one of the brothers is mentally challenged in some way. There's like a lot of references, like they think I'm dumb, they think I'm stupid, and the one brother is afraid that the other brother is not going. And again, because they look identical and they talk the same and look the same, I can't be more specific.
But they're supposed to be. Yeah.
But one of them is that there is this sort of anxiety that he's going to be closer friends with the character played by Todd Smith, who I think is also just called Todd. I think their names are in the movie just Mark, John, and Todd. I just forget who plays who. There's this anxiety where it's like, oh, I'm going to be abandoned because I'm dumb, and they're going to not want to be around me. And um because you're seeing this movie shot by teenagers playing very thinly veiled versions of themselves in their home, and it looks like they just shot it while unsupervised in their home in a movie about being unsupervised. Like, the whole thing is like, it's very easy, especially because these themes also return in Splatter Farm, to read like, oh, this was an actual dynamic with them. Like, this is what their actual relationship was like. The story itself is very strange because I think they think that they're making a high concept movie. Like, I think they read a dictionary definition of hallucination and were like, wow, what a crazy concept. Like, even though most horror movies have hallucinations in them, it's like a very low concept idea to be in a horror movie. But the idea is they just keep hallucinating these terrible things happening to them. And this is where all the gore effects come in. And then they'll wake up, or they'll like wake out of a daydream and they'll be like, oh my God, that was so scary. But then there's also just scenes where they're just sort of like, it's ostensibly a sleepover, but they're just in separate rooms, just doing whatever. There's a lot of scenes of people just chilling on a couch doing nothing.
Yeah, there's a lot of naps. A lot of naps.
People taking naps. It is so, the gore effects are pretty good, especially considering how it was made.
Yeah.
They know how to stage this stuff. They know like how to edit a sequence. So like there's a hallucination scene where one of the brothers shits out a knife.
Yeah, like a big kitchen knife.
And it's like the way it's cut and the way they keep, the way it's edited and the shots they choose and everything. It's like, it's kind of effective. It kind of, they pulled it off. It, like, the blood looks fake and there's not any particularly elaborate effects going on, but yes, that is someone shitting out a knife.
Yeah. And then he kind of barfs up his intestines, so I'm pretty sure that they had seen City of the Living Dead or Gates of Hell.
Well, I mean, this movie literally, some of these movies, they like to really, especially later on, I more associate this with like the later 90s and the more of the digital video era, like a lot of the trauma pickups of that era. But like a lot of these filmmakers like to sort of wear their influences on their sleeves and will just have a character reading a Fangoria magazine or something.
Right.
And this movie opens with one of them like reading a book on Herschel Gordon Lewis. And it's very clear that these are like two horror geeks who know their shit and want to go.
That's why the Ripper guy not knowing his shit pissed me off even more. Because he's the adult in the room.
Yeah, he's operating in a space where everyone is a total nerd who can, cite chapter and verse on all of these gore movies, but he didn't know that The Conqueror Worm wasn't about a worm. But it's got...
There's also a part where there's a lot of showering and bathing in their movies too. They kind of like to shoot themselves nearly naked. And I think it's John is in the shower and gets attacked by this sort of, I don't know if it's supposed to look like a penis or if it's supposed to look like
it's supposed to look like a penis.
It's sort of a xenomorph penis looking thing attacks him. And it doesn't look like a real creature, but it's a pretty fun little sculpture.
Yeah.
That I hope they hung on to for at least a while.
There's a lot of homoerotic imagery in both this and Splatter Farm, and I don't think that it's an earnest expression of their sexuality. I think it's, again, just their sense of humor. Like, I think that's their way of just like, oh, wouldn't it be gross and hilarious if this was kind of gay? So like there is an earnest sort of emotional through line that I don't even know if they knew that they were putting in their movies when they made them. In that sort of like protective relationship that the two brothers have. And by the end, there is sort of like emotional stakes to like, oh no, we got to get out of this together, But also there is just this like snotty sense of humor. And like there's a lot of them naked, and because they are just so skinny and weird looking, I think they just think it's funny to like have their bodies on display. It's also like one of those things that you watch it and you're like, okay, these kids are not 18. Like technically this footage is, I don't know if any major label would ever release this movie. I don't know if Kino would go there because it has like 16-year-old boys showering, even though it's the 16-year-old boys who shot themselves showering. It's not,
and there's it's not like we should be clear. There's no frontal nudity. It's just,
there is some, you do see their butts.
Very close. Yeah, you see their butts. And I believe, I'm trying to remember, there's a scene where one of them, either Mark or John, attacks, Todd is attacked and a very homoerotic way on a bed at one point.
Uh-huh.
And there's one joke that I don't think was supposed to be a gay joke or even a joke that's just a very funny sight gag to me, where because they're having a sleepover, the two brothers wake up in bed and they're having a conversation, and Todd's sleeping on the floor and sits up, and it's such perfect timing that he's also a part of this conversation. And I don't think it was on purpose, but it made me laugh so hard that oh yeah, I'm also in this room, and I'm on the floor because I'm a child, and children sleep on the floor when their friends are twin brothers with only two beds.
So this movie is sort of beloved in this sphere for good cause, in my belief, because this is a movie that it has that feeling of like, let's put on a show. Like, it has that earnest kind of kids playing dress up and putting on a movie, even though they don't quite know what a movie is.
Right.
But it also is like very fast paced and has a lot of pretty effective gags that are all the more charming because they are so rudimentary and made for. This is clearly a movie made for no money at all.
It's just under an hour,
and it is also just under an hour, and it's on Amazon Prime. And it is just a lot of fun. And if you are someone who, as a kid, you got your friends together and made a bad Scream ripoff or a bad Evil Dead ripoff, I think you will find this movie impossibly heartwarming, despite the fact that it has a bunch of gay jokes and like a guy shitting out a knife and stuff like that. Like, I think there is a sweetness to their movies, even as they try to gross you out and try to be transgressive. There is a sweetness to it that I find really endearing. I love this movie quite a bit. So then the next movie is Night of Terror from 1986 by Felix Gerard. This is one of those movies that qualifies, but it's only partially shot on video because it has big stretches of it that are taken from an older movie that was shot on film, The Frozen Scream.
Which is one of those movies that had a it has a cult following simply because it was a video nasty. Frozen Scream, that is.
I see.
It's one of the many video nasties that has no reason to have a cult following. It's kind of boring.
That happens a lot. Is filmmakers reusing footage, especially these SOV filmmakers tend to really steal stuff from other movies that they've made, and then put it in there. And so we'll talk about that sort of thing popping up a little later. The next one is Spine from 1986, which is directed by John Howard and Justin Simmons. So this is a film that was made by producers that exclusively made bondage films. So obviously we're talking about shot on video horror, but the other market that exploded in the age of video was porn. For obvious reasons, porn is infinitely more appealing when you can see it in the privacy of your own home as opposed to in a movie theater.
Yeah.
For most people, I would say. There are some people, I'm sure movie theater was like the reason to see porn. But that was a market that operated on a whole different scale once VCRs sort of became a common thing. And in fact, a lot of the it was not a huge thing in America, but there was still some sort of outrage and hysteria around kids watching violent horror movies on videotape. And one of the things that's commonly cited in those kind of news reports and stuff is that these are movies not being made by Hollywood, but being made by pornographers, which is not...
Yeah.
Oh, it's just like there's plenty of pornographers in Hollywood.
Yeah.
like are you talking about are you talking about Spine, or are you talking about The Hills Have Eyes? Because they both apply. But so this is a movie that is actually made by pornographers. This is the producers who made bondage videos thought they could branch out and make a slasher movie, and they couldn't. It sucks. It's terrible. It is extremely boring. There is no gore effect of any kind. Most of the kills, they're just about to happen, and then it fades to black. There's a whole lot of moments in this movie that just sort of fade to black because they don't know how to end a scene. It's a lot of stuff that you watch it and you go, yes, this feels like the part in porn movies before they have sex. Except that instead of just being like, I always viewed those sequences in porn movies, and there's different filmmakers operated within the adult film industry, but generally there's a sort of deliberate tease of building of anticipation where those scenes exist, because if they just showed the scenes of the sex without any narrative or anything, then it would be over too quickly. So they're trying to build up anticipation, but in this case, it's just really, really terrible police procedural that has no purpose to exist. It's not building up any kind of anticipation for anything. And at the end, the murderer has like 3 women tied up. So I'm sure that those were women who the producers already knew from their other work. Spine, available on YouTube.
It has a video box that is graphic enough that I probably would have rented it had I ever run across it as a teenager or 20-something.
Yeah, I think this is one of those movies that was notorious for having an enticing box and an absolutely dreadful movie inside the box.
Mm-hmm.
The next one we have not seen, but I really would like to see, because it's just one of the weirdest premises for any of these movies. Splatter, Architects of Fear from 1986 by Peter Rowe. So, this is partially a mockumentary, which is to say a fake documentary about a film crew making a shot-on-video horror film, and showing behind the scenes of how that works. It is also an actual documentary, because there are parts of that mockumentary where they literally just have special effects people showing you how the gore effects work. And they're not really playing fictional characters or anything. They're just, here's how the gore scenes in some of the movies you love might have been achieved, basically. But it has a overarching sci-fi high concept premise where this is a shot-on-video horror movie that's being made in the post-apocalypse. Like, it sounds like such a hopelessly convoluted plot, and because I haven't seen it, I don't exactly know how that all squares together. But it's a very fascinating, but apparently it is kind of boring, because it is mostly just you see a gore effect happen, and then you see the setup for how the gore effect happens. But again, instructional videotapes, how to, perfect your golf swing, do this, do that. There were, if you looked in the back pages of Fangoria magazine in the 80s, there were absolutely mail order tapes that would tell you how to do special effects. And if you were to tell me that the Polonia Brothers, got those tapes and then made Hallucinations, like, I'd believe you 100%. So this kind of exists in that sphere as much as it exists in the sphere of the horror film. So I find it a fascinating object to exist, Splatter, Architects of Fear, but also probably not a great movie.
Yeah, I hadn't even heard of that one until we did this.
But it is on YouTube, so if you want to check it out, it's there. Another movie that has a fascinating origin story is Black River Monster from 1986 by John Duncan. Because there was a horse ranch for girls called the Black River Farm and Ranch, and they hired a company to make a fictional movie set there as like a promotional item. So I think the idea was that they would send this video out to video stores, and then it would be an advertisement for their ranch, but also they could sell the videotape to people who come and visit the ranch and be like, hey, they shot a movie here, do you want to, it's like they being us, but we're not going to tell you that. So this is a 50-minute long, kind of dreamy, slow, uneventful kind of a thing about a Bigfoot monster coming and killing people on a ranch.
Bigfoot movies are usually, worth their salt.
This movie, the review I read on Bleeding Skull, and by the way, big shout out to Bleeding Skull for making this podcast possible, because so many of these movies...
Yeah, doing everybody's research for them.
So many of these movies we couldn't see. I was at least able to read the Bleeding Skull review and be like, okay, I know where I stand on this movie. Even if I don't always agree with their opinions on things, like, they at least know what they're talking about. And they're not just some person with a WordPress blog yelling about how crap everything is and whatever. But Black River Monster... They specifically mentioned that a movie like Night of the Demon has Bigfoot.
Yeah, which
has Bigfoot as like the most horrendous monster in the universe, doing like absolutely despicable things. Whereas Black River Monster, Bigfoot hugs a goat.
Man, I really, really love the movie Night of the Demon. That is the Bigfoot movie.
Yeah.
It's funny that this was an ad for a horse ranch because I actually, when my mother lived in Honolulu, I went to visit, and we went and rode horses on a ranch that's big claim to fame is what it was where some of the scenes in Jurassic Park were shot.
Oh yeah, of course.
So they had Jurassic Park shit everywhere.
That's funny. Yeah, I think this is the same thing. I think this is
the budget version of that.
I think that this is someone who owned this ranch going, you know what? He rented one of these shot on video horror movies and was like, we could do that here. And then it existed. Now, Night Ripper from 1986.
Actually, wait, hold on a second.
Yeah.
I'm noticing on our notes, do we have Terror at 10 Killer?
I took that off because I looked at it and I watched clips from all over the movie and I determined that it was shot on film.
Okay, cool. Because I was unclear on that one.
I'm not a forensic expert. I couldn't say 100%, but I was 90% sure that Terror at 10 Killer is not shot on video.
That's good enough for me. So yeah, then we'll move on to Night Ripper, which has exclamation points, so I think it's Night Ripper. 1986, Jeff Hathcock, which sounds like a joke name. I actually watched this one back to back with Ripper, the Ripper, without really putting together that they were both going to be Jack the Ripper things. I don't know that has the word Ripper in the title. You didn't watch this one, did you? You didn't get a chance to see this one.
I did not, no.
Okay, so the thing I like about this one is that it's sort of built around a budget Glamour Shots studio. And Glamour Shots is a thing that I'm pretty sure still exists. I think I've seen them at the mall in the past 10 years. But it feels essentially 80s.
It would be really hard to describe to a Zoomer what Glamour Shots is and why it exists.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to do my best here. It was a place where you would go, and it was aimed mostly at young women and girls, but I definitely know that other people went there. And they would dress you up in, pretty ugly clothing, and they would tease your hair. I always remember they had those big, swoopy, early 90s hairstyles, and they would take a bunch of pictures of you with soft focus, and they had printed on parchment that had like sparkles on it. And I don't know how much it would cost. I just remember when I worked at Kinko's, people would bring their Glamour Shots in for us to copy all the time. And I'd have to explain that technically you own this picture, but you don't own the rights to reproduce this picture. And I would have to explain copyright law to people at least once a month.
Were you a Glamour Shots narc? You didn't just go ahead and copy it for him?
It depended if my manager was there or not. Honestly, if I was there and it was just me and the shift manager, I would just copy whatever the hell they gave me. I copied somebody's homemade pornography before. Like, they just had a bunch of naked pictures of themselves, and they big fat guy walked right up to the counter and handed me. And I was just like, yeah, okay, whatever, man. And I let a woman make a whole bunch of color copies of herself in she didn't want me to do it, but she made a whole bunch of color copies of herself doing bondage gear stuff. And then she tricked me, which it was my own fault. She made a bunch of color copies.
Wait, can I just say?
It sounds like those two things are related.
Like, this is the beginning of a Penthouse Forum letter, and let me just say before I go any further that I was tricked. And normally I would never like a ball gag, but
no, what had happened was the Kinko's I worked at, for some reason, even though they were way more expensive, it didn't have a counter for the color copies. It was just like an honor system. If it was later hours when it was just me, I couldn't stand next to the person while they made the copies. And so she bought like 10 copies, and then later that night I went to clean out the trash, and there was just like 50 half naked pictures of this woman in the trash can. She didn't even like tear them up or anything, and I was just like, oh fuck, I'm gonna get in so much trouble. The counts are gonna be off.
So Glamour Shots was you go to the mall, and they say we'll make you feel like a model.
Yeah. Okay. So, and Giallo fans might know that they're one of the seminal early Giallos was Mario Bava's Blood and Black Lace, which is a murder mystery that takes place around a sort of model house where they do photography and they get them together. And so this felt like the budget version of Blood and Black, like the budget 80s remake of Blood and Black Lace. It all takes place around a glamour shots studio, and it's not even glamour shots, it's sub glamour shots. So it already had me. I was already enjoying it. I did not read your notes on this one, so I got really far into the movie with this one guy, because it's the only one of these ones I watched that was a slasher movie that actually attempted a murder mystery. Their problem is they only have 2 suspects. They don't give us enough red herrings, so it's very obvious who the killer is. But the obvious red herring is this creepy guy who keeps who is in charge of the studio, and he keeps everybody around him abreast on the happenings on these murders. He's too interested in these murders, and he's a little too gross when he's flirting with women. So he's the obvious red herring. But he was a much better actor than everybody else, and he was very recognizable. And he's the soup Nazi from Seinfeld. I had to figure that out for myself by looking it up on IMDb in the middle of the movie. I'm like, this guy has to have been in other stuff. He's actually kind of good, and he's got sort of a scary air about him. And then when he figures out who the real killer is, he has a pretty good scene where he's like, I'm gonna go call the cops now. And so that's what I think it's best known for, is it's this really early movie from this actor who ended up being sort of a sitcom mainstay. But anyway, so there's these Jack the Ripper murders occurring around this town, and there's this guy who works at this glamour shots place and has this mean girlfriend, and this pretty girl walks in, and he has he's decides he wants to photograph her, basically falls instantly in love with her, and conveniently figures out that his fiance's been cheating anyway. So that's like the drama of the story. And then meanwhile, there are these murders happening, so you have the creepy soup Nazi, and then you have the lesbian woman who delivers the final shots to people, who keeps it's like a really, really unfortunate stereotype where she is like hitting on the women and making them really uncomfortable and looking at the pictures and being like, hey, that kind of stuff.
Sure, yeah, it's from
and
the
so
80s. Yeah,
the fact that she's the only other suspect. And there's one point where they sort of deflect away from her by having a scene with her and her girlfriend, and it's a pseudo sweet-natured scene where she is just all broken up about a friend of an ex of hers who was murdered. But of course, she was the one who murdered her, and so that part's really disappointing. But they do have a showdown in Mannequin Warehouse, where she is trying to kill this one actress who is clearly hired because she's an actual model, and not because she was an actress, and she had trouble even speaking English lines. She's I'm guessing German or Swedish or something. She wants to be part of that photographing session because she wants to murder her, and the soup Nazi figures out why she won't leave. And so she first kills the soup Nazi and then fights with this woman in the mannequin studio. And it's pretty good. It's pretty good action, and it fits with the thing that I always call the Patrick Ripoll seal of goodness on a slasher movie being this kind of movie that is interrupted by a slasher movie.
Yeah.
Blank isn't. This is really a soap opera about guys who work at a glamour shots being interrupted every 15 or so minutes by a murder scene.
Love it. Love to see it.
And it works so well that way that it almost seems like a spoof. Like it seems like it's spoofing both soap operas and slasher movies, but that's not the case. It's taking it seriously. And another good score, and interestingly enough, it's credited to a guy named Bill Parsley, who his other credits are as orchestrators for the show Rocko's Modern Life, the Nicktoon, which had a really good soundtrack actually. And it has this synth pop thing going on, but it also has this really wistful There's this chime effect on early keyboards that I don't know what, it probably has some name. And it's specifically the thing you would score soap operas with back in the day. So you would have like really early soap operas would all be live scored by a organ of some
Mm-hmm.
type, and then during like the 70s and 80s, that organ was replaced by this keyboard, and it would almost always be this soft chime thing.
And is it shot on like that kind of soap opera video equipment too, or is it more camcordery?
It was hard to tell because the version that was on YouTube was in pretty bad shape.
Ah,
But based on the fact that it had actual actors in it, I was guessing that it was probably shot using that sort of footage. So it might be really interesting to see it in higher resolution and really get that entire soap opera meets slasher movie vibe from it. But it's not very good. It was just one I happened to enjoy a little bit more than some of the other ones, mostly for its setup. Uh, which then that will bring me to another one I think only I saw, Blood Lake from
that's true.
'87 by
I did
Tim
not get around to
Boggs.
this one.
This one, I actually in my brain have confused a lot of the stuff that happened in this with stuff that happened in Sledgehammer. They have enough in common. Um, this one I think was the first one I ended up watching for this whole project, maybe the second one. It's really close to just being a standard slasher movie, but then it has this like pretty impressive heavy metal soundtrack. It's from a band called Voyager. I couldn't find much on them, but there's sort of like, what if Judas Priest had a saxophone player? Kind of is the best way I can think of to describe
Okay.
them.
All right.
But it's clear that the filmmakers had a relationship with this band. It didn't seem like they shared any members, but they feature their songs a lot. So in a lot of slasher movies, there's a scene of the people who are going to be slashed driving from the city to this rural area where they're going to be murdered. Um, and the thing, and so like a good movie plays spooky music and has the credits over it. And most of these movies will literally just be someone driving. Splatter Farm, for instance, is just literally these people driving out to the location where there'll be the murders. This one, it has a sort of music video feel to it, so it's these people driving out to the middle of nowhere with this like Judas Priest with a saxophone kind of music playing. So I really like that about it.
I think
And
my
I
all-time
also
favorite one of those is from the Mutilator.
Yeah, and so this movie actually reminded me a lot of The Mutilator, which is, I think, something that made me like it a little bit more
Ah,
because I really like The Mutilator, but The Mutilator is very brief and has really outstanding gore effects, and so and also I kind of like the characters in The Mutilator. This one's a case where I distinctly didn't like the characters, like to the point where if I wasn't watching it for this podcast, I might have actually stopped watching the movie because I was so annoyed by the characters, which is really unusual for me, considering how many slasher movies I watch. The problem here was that it's some 20 somethings, and they've taken two actual children with them who are like tweens, and there are lots of scenes of people, like happens in a Friday the 13th or The Burning, where people talking about sex. And so not only are they talking about sex with the children, but basically the men are encouraging the tween boy to sexually harass this girl. Like most of their scenes are them, him
like
saying,
in the guise of like we're giving you advice on how to be a man, like that sort
but
of
like
thing.
right in front of her, in the guise of being funny, and it's
I see.
really uncomfortable. It really sucks. So I really hated that about it. But I did sort of like, there is a immediate murder at the very beginning of the movie, but from there it actually takes, I counted 48 minutes of the 72-minute long movie for actual murders to begin.
Oh boy.
So a lot of it is just hanging out with people who are bored. So there's drinking. There's one really funny scene where they play a drinking game with quarters. That I guess is that game where you have to bounce the quarters into the glass. And the director has put a crumpled up bag of chips in the scene, and the crumpled up bag of chips is covering up the glass. So it's like, a good 3 to 5 minute scene of people.
So even the ostensible drama of will the quarter go in is totally eliminated by
Yeah,
the
because
framing
you
of the
can't
shot.
see. And for all, they could use this to cheat, I suppose, but they don't seem to be because the scene just keeps going. Uh,
So this is where a studio, some producer, is good. I do feel
yes.
this. This is something that when you watch a big franchise, a big studio franchise slasher, a Nightmare on Elm Street, a Friday 13th, a Halloween, something that they never ever do is wait a long time for the murders to start. You
Yes.
always feel when you watch those movies that someone has gone through the script and said, nah, it's been 7 pages and no one's been killed yet. We got to put someone in there. And it's like, all right, we'll just add a hitchhiker, I guess. It's like, okay, fine, whatever. It just needs to be a kill there. They never make that mistake in the more polished productions. But here in SOV, pacing can be kind of a crapshoot.
Especially when your movie is only 72 minutes anyway.
Yeah.
It has scenes of people like on speedboats and, and the murderer is really disappointing. He's just like a slightly overweight man with a hat. The soundtrack, the synth score that wasn't the part by the band Voyager, I couldn't really describe this very well, but it reminded me of the Genesis version of Zombies Ate My Neighbors.
Okay.
So that was sort of appealing.
Yeah, a little FM synth.
Yeah, so not a recommended movie,
No.
and some really gross shit going on.
Brain Blast from 1987 is the next film by Andy Neal, an Australian shot on video movie, our first Australian movie. Hard to call this horror. I understand why it would be in some lists because it's sort of aggressive and it's very much a cult object. It feels like a prefab cult object. What it mostly feels like is someone saw Liquid Sky and was like, well, we could do that. And then they got equipment from a local public access television channel and then shot this sort of... I forget if this is in Melbourne or somewhere else in Australia, but basically it's just like the local punk scene there. Sci-fi movie where punks are getting addicted to this hyper new drug that looks like you put like a hairbrush to your neck and then you inject it in your drug and it's crazy, and it's trying very hard and it's just a little too corny to really work. The thing about shot on video movies is that you're existing in the same space as Black Devil Doll from Hell. You're existing in the same space as Nick Millard movies and Alien Beast by Carl Sukenik and stuff. Like you are existing in a world where everything is edgy, like everything's really edgy and off-putting, and like to be the quote-unquote punk rock thing in there, like you really got to push the boundaries, and they don't. So it's unfortunate because shot on video is something that I associate with punk, like the punk ethos, just because it is so DIY. But when you watch these movies, they very rarely actually have any real punk rock subculture in it. It mostly just feels like weirdos who aren't connected into any kind of culture.
I mean, that could be the issue of suburban rural thing, whereas punk is
right. They're not
thing.
In the 80s. Punk was urban. It was not quite by the time I was a teenager, like anyone in any mall in America could, be wearing a Misfits shirt and,
they sold them there.
have armbands with anarchy symbols on them. So but in the 80s, I guess it was more urban. So I was kind of excited to be like, oh, cool. A weirdo sci-fi punk rock SOV movie. That seems cool. And there is a cool soundtrack and there's a lot of cool video effects. There's shots that take place inside of a production studio of some sort of television, back scenes, behind the scenes at a news, where they're producing the news. I forget what you call that sort of control room area. But there's scenes that take place inside that room, and then there's a bunch of video effects. So clearly, someone knew someone, and it's kind of fun. It's there's the evil drug dealer who's this weird looking guy, and there's a the only scene that you could really call like gory is at the very end when all of these junkies commit suicide. But it's not very, and there's like sex scenes that have weird video effects on them, and there's some clever dialogue, but then there's also just a lot of bad poetry. So again, it just feels like it's trying too hard to be weirdo and out there. But it's just like, man, you're corny. Like, you're not scaring me, you know?
So maybe just stick to like Liquid Sky and Black Moon and Dead End Drive-In.
Yeah.
Blast.
Liquid Sky feels like a much more earnest underground thing. And this is the time, the late 80s. This is about the time when New York underground film scene was having, I think this is about around the time when like Nick Zed and them were doing like the cinema of transgression and stuff. And we'll talk.
What's the Combat Shock guy's name? I can't remember.
Sure, yeah. But no, exactly, that sort of thing. So like, this is concurrent with stuff that is a lot more successful in the thing it's trying to do. But it's not terrible. It's just a little embarrassing.
Yeah.
But speaking of trying to do something, very ambitious movie next up, Video Violence, 1987 from Gary Cohen. Very special place in my heart. I want to give a shout out to the Marine who manages the website badmovies.org, which I don't think has been updated since 2013, but in the early aughts, this was one of the premier websites that you could go to read sort of comedic reviews of bad cult movies or whatever. Because he had waves, you know, in the early days of the internet, you would download waves of dialogue, and he had video clips. He uploaded his own video clips in an era before streaming sites. It was very hard to find video clips of stuff, but he uploaded his own MPEGs of these shot on video movies and stuff. And I saw his review of Video Violence, and I watched the video clip, which is the scene in the sort of roadside diner, deli, convenience store, gas station kind of place where the couple gets killed and then their arm gets used on the deli slicer.
The deli slicer.
And that was the first time I ever seen anything shot on videotape, and I thought that was the craziest, coolest thing. And it opened my brain not just to shot on video movies, but to the idea that the sort of established canon of B movies, the sort of like, oh yeah, there's Them, that's the giant ant movie, and there's Plan 9 from Outer Space, and like, it's like actually the world of weird movies is much, much bigger than what plays on cable, you know, than what plays on TNT late at night. And that was my exposure to that. So Video Violence was the very first shot on video movie I ever watched, because the first time I went into a video store that had it, I rented it. And I am very fond of it. I think it's a really cool movie.
Actually, it was one that was at a lot of video stores when I was in my teens and 20s, and I never rented it because I always assumed it was another one of these trailer collections.
Oh yeah,
based on its title, but it had the big box, and it's a bloody hand putting a video cassette into a really dated looking VHS player. Yeah, so I actually ran across this a bazillion times, and I just never rented it because I didn't think it was a narrative movie. I thought it was just a compilation. And so this was the first time I had seen it, and it's almost so much. It's so ambitious in terms of the concept, and it's actually having scripted dialogue and actors like not just filling space or improvising. But it's really the concept alone is enough that puts it in front of so many of these movies that it honestly felt weird watching it towards the end of this sort of run of shot on video movies, that it was like, it really feels like a Herschel Gordon Lewis movie to me.
It does.
It feels like a movie he'd be jealous that he didn't think of.
Yes. I think it's such a brilliant premise, and it could have been made for more money by someone else if someone else had the idea, and it would be a movie that more people would know about. As is, I think it has a pretty good reputation among people who are inclined to enjoy it in the first place. So I don't think Gary Cohen got the short end of the stick by any means, but it's about a guy who is tired of the big city. It's like the same setup as a lot of horror and like serial killer thrillers, where it's like the guy from the big New York City, and he's just like, I can't take it there anymore. It's too crazy. So he used to run a movie theater there, but now he's opening a video store in upstate New York. Actually, I think it's shot in Bayonne, New Jersey, or a couple other places in New Jersey. And one day, a video gets returned in the Dropbox. By the way, a lot of these movies have scenes in video stores. It's like a real thing. These are filmed, like, these are movies made by horror dorks, and horror dorks in the 80s, the most holy place in their world was the video store, as we've talked about, and like they pay tribute to that place. So way more than movie theaters, video stores appear in so many of these films. So this guy runs a video store and he picks a tape from the drops, but it's not his tape, it's some other blank tape. So he puts it in the VCR to maybe see whose it is, and what he sees is a murder, and he's not entirely sure if it's an actual murder or if it's simulated, but he's seen enough horror movies and he knows, well, this is not shot on film, this is shot on videotape.
he makes the distinction to his wife that it doesn't look like film, and that's suspicious.
Like, and the fact that he's specifically a former movie theater owner is, to me, thematically extremely funny in this. So he takes it to the sheriff, and the sheriff it's that typical horror plot of just like, you're imagining things, like what you're saying is too preposterous, and by the time they get back to the video store, the tape has disappeared mysteriously, and from then on he keeps encountering these tapes and trying to figure out what's going on, trying to get to the bottom of it. But no one believes him because of that initial thing, and he's the new guy in town. So there's a little bit of Jaws in this as well, with Sheriff Brody being the former big city cop who comes to the small town, and everyone thinks that he's just paranoid about sharks. But it turns out that this is a town of murderers who they love snuff. They can't get enough of snuff, so they shoot their own snuff videos for any outsiders that come by, and then they rent it to each other and watch it. And it is a movie about the entertainment industry going public. It is a movie about a small community taking their own enjoyment into their own hands. It is the horror snuff version of Be Kind, Rewind. It is a celebration of... It is both... so the story Gary Cohen tells about the making of this movie is that he says that he ran a video store, and he had the exact same situation that the character has in this movie, where he's disgusted by how popular horror is and how it sells, or how it rents so much more frequently than all the classic movies that he loves. And... you know, there's specifically a scene that he says actually played out in his life where a mother goes, this is rated R. Would my kids be able to watch it? Is there a lot of sex in it? And he goes, well, no, it's probably for all the violence. And she goes, oh, okay, then I'll rent it. And so that might make you think that this is a very reactionary movie from a guy who is like clutching his pearls over video violence. This might be someone who is sympathetic to the sort of aims of the British legislators who created video nasties and all that. But like, the movie itself has a sense of humor and a knowing irony to it, that it isn't that. It isn't clutching its pearls over violence. In fact, it's saying, I understand why. This is why violent movies are popular, because they're fun, and you watch them and you go, what is even happening? And that sense of... And I even understand why shot on video horror movies are popular. Or not even just shot on video, but why low budget, grimy, violent, disreputable horror movies are popular. And it's because you can tell that everyone's having a great time making them, that they can't believe what they're getting away with. And it is a movie about why gross movies with no redeeming social value, in fact, do have a redeeming social value. And it's a celebration while also still having a mystery plot that works.
Yeah, I mean, it's like another one that feels like a Twilight Zone episode.
Yeah.
The Herschel Gordon Lewis, and it reminded me of Clerks, and it's probably just because of the video store angle, and there being long scenes where people talk about movies.
Yes, I would say that if Kevin Smith was working in a slightly different version than. There's a version of Kevin Smith's career which is he makes Clerks on videotape in color and it goes to Troma and he becomes a different kind of cult filmmaker with way less reach.
Yeah, I mean, and so it was like, but at the same time, as I was thinking that the Herschel Gordon Lewis, it feels like something. It feels like something that would come out of 2000 Maniacs or something. Like it's a kind of story that he would like. That it's an excuse to do gory shit, but also funny. I have to say, I didn't find the jokes particularly funny throughout, but the concept and the way that the main guy has to be a straight man for everything was all very funny to me.
And his jacket is very funny to me.
What was his jacket? I don't remember.
It's some weird pleather like jacket thing. I don't know, but he's very funny. But like the thing that makes the movie work is that the murder scenes are very long and drawn out and genuinely like vicious and nasty.
Yeah.
And I think that if this movie tried to pull its punches, if this movie tried to be like, well, like this is a movie about someone who's shocked by real violence or whatever, but like I'm not one of those creeps. Like if this movie thought it was above delivering you that sort of thing, or if this movie tried to like be like, oh, like if all the like, because there's a moment where someone's hand gets chopped off by an electric carving knife, and then they bring the sort of section of arm over to a deli slicer and just start slicing like
pieces
slices out of it. And like if everything that happened in the movie was in that tenor, then it would have just been like, oh, it's goofy and it could have still worked, but it wouldn't be as good a defense of disgusting films. But because this movie is very specifically kind of disgusting and there's like just scenes that make you feel gross, and then at the end you're like, oh no, it is fun. Everyone was having fun. Like, I think this movie works so much better, and it's so funny. So many of these movies are fascinating, and some of these movies are actually very complicated and have a lot of layers to them, but usually it's just because they're made by complicated, weird, fascinating people, and not because they're made by people who set out with a goal to make those kinds of movies.
Yeah.
There's one other one on this list that I think does a really amazing job of that. But this movie is very remarkable because it has those thematic ambitions.
I'd say watch it. The second best of the scores too.
Really great score.
We're talking about those moody scores, I would say that Cards of Death is the only one that had a score I liked more than this one.
It really makes me want to watch Gary Cohen's other movies, and unfortunately, the only other Gary Cohen movie I've seen is Video Violence 2, the sequel, which is not a sequel to this movie. It's just called Video Violence 2. It's really a sketch comedy movie where the punchline at the end is gore, and they're all terrible, and it's just really worthless. I think the only way you can really see Video Violence 2 is it comes along with the DVD for Video Violence 1. So it's it's not really worth warning people away from it, because I really think people should see Video Violence 1. But if you're thinking, oh, and there's a sequel, like, nah, not really.
Not really. We got a bunch in a row that neither of us were able to see now.
Yeah. We got Cannibal Hookers from 1987 by Donald Farmer. I think this is the first appearance of Donald Farmer, but on our list, but he is one of the more prolific video horror filmmakers, and he is one of them who I think is still making horror movies. A lot of these filmmakers have sort of found new life by just putting their stuff on Amazon Prime, because anyone can upload their stuff to Amazon Prime, and Amazon Prime will sort of monetize it the way a YouTube video is monetized. So depending on how many people you can get to watch your movie that's free streaming on Prime, you can actually make a very meager budget back. So he's still working on that, but this is the first movie of his that's on our list. It's about two girls. They're pretending to be hookers in order to fulfill a sorority initiation, and then somehow they become zombies, and then basically they keep getting picked up by guys as if they're real hookers, and then when they go back to the guy's place, they eat them, and it's just sort of the same thing over and over again. Not a lot of people particularly like it, though I do think it's worth noting that it was reimagined by Farmer and Carolyn Kupko, who is a Letterboxd user who goes by the name of Scumbellina, and she is one of the foremost users on that site, who is I would say, an expert on video trash of all sorts, not just horror movies. And I follow her on Letterboxd, and I've always appreciate what she has to say, not just about movies like this, but kids movies and fantasy movies and full moon movies, things like that. She has a really good taste for that sort of thing. And together she co-directed a reimagined version of Cannibal Hookers in 2017 called Hooker with a Hacksaw that is a very fun, no-budget horror movie. And I enjoyed Hooker with a Hacksaw quite a bit. So I would recommend that one. That's shot digitally and from 2017, so it's not on our list.
I think that Cannibal Hookers was one of 3 or 4 movies that some video label put out as a fake sequel to I Spit on Your Grave. I can't remember.
Well, Donald Farmer made a fake sequel to I Spit on Your Grave.
Oh, did he?
So we'll talk about that a little later.
It was probably included.
Savage Vengeance is that one. We'll talk about that a bit later. Also, Channel 13, Mark Polonia, probably by John Polonia as well, but the story for this one is that it was this lost movie that wasn't released for 30 years, and then something inspired Mark, in 2017 or something along then, to complete it and then release it, I guess on DVD or somewhere. So and by then John Polonia was no longer alive, so he's the sole credited director. Inspired by Amicus, it's hosted by a hooded monk on TV. It's like someone coming home and putting on TV and then watching the stories in there. There's killer scarecrows, there's bird monsters, there's a cannibal farm. So it's an anthology film. We got Cemetery Sisters from 1987 by Nick Millard. We'll talk about Nick Millard later. Unfortunately, we won't be talking about him right now. But he's one of the most fascinating filmmakers that has ever worked in this space. It's about sisters who seduce and kill rich men for their wealth. And it's got Nick Millard pacing. And we'll talk about Nick Millard pacing a little later. Speaking of which, Fat Ethel 2, also known as Criminally Insane 2 from 1987, also by Nick Millard. It's another one that we talked about where it's partially shot on video because it's mostly made up of flashbacks to a previous film that was shot on celluloid.
Which was, I believe, released by Troma. Crazy Fat Ethel is a Troma release.
Nick Millard had a career before videotape and had a bit of a following. And I think this movie was specifically him going back and exploiting his following that movie Gabe. Mm-hmm. But it's only in the present day, which was shot like 15 years later, for like about half of it. So I was going to watch this because it is on YouTube, but I realized I hadn't seen the original, so I skipped it. Next we have Crowley from 1987, directed by Ricardo Islas, a Uruguayan shot on video movie. Uruguay not known for its film industry.
No.
So this is already unique. So there's 2 possible plot lines for this because I've read a review of this movie that had one plot line and the IMDb synopsis is the other. And one doesn't seem like it has anything to do with the title and the other is less detailed. So I'm going to go ahead and say that one of them is wrong. So this is either a movie about the soul of Aleister Crowley returning to the body of a shy university professor after he wears a VR helmet, or it's about a vampire sucking the blood of residents of a coastal town. That was from the review on the Bloody Pit of Horror website that I read. It was made by a 16-year-old, and there was a sequel. So a 16-year-old Uruguayan picked up his camcorder and made history. We also have another Donald Farmer film, Demon Queen from 1987. It's a succubus movie. Apparently it doesn't really have much of a plot, but it does have a lot of weird video effects and droning music, and there's a lot of gore and a lot of sex. I don't think Donald Farmer was a filmmaker who was particularly interested in stories or characters. I think he was just sort of like a string of scenes kind of guy. But I think this was one of the more known seminal shot-on-video horror movies. It's just not available online.
Yeah. It's one that I always used to see at the video store. The box art's very familiar. It's one of those images that was famously recycled through other studios. If you needed a cover, there's this one image, of a screaming woman who's kind of falling apart.
I know exactly what you're talking about. There's also Body Count from 1987 by Dr. Lionel Schenken. It was a made-for-TV production. This is another emeritus film, like The Tower. It is not to be confused with the 1986 Rogerio Deodato slasher movie, Body Count. When you search for this movie, a lot of Google will just assume that you're talking about the other one and got the year wrong.
Yeah.
But this is in fact a different movie. It has a bad reputation. It's slow and not much of a slasher movie. It's kind of more thriller procedural, apparently. But that brings us to Dr. Bloodbath from 1987 by Nick Millard. Did you see this game?
No, they didn't get a chance to watch this one.
Have you seen any Nick Millard films?
I thought I had, but I'm starting to think I maybe have not.
So Nick Millard, I don't know the full story. I'm sure it's fascinating because you watch these. He's definitely one of those filmmakers where you're just like, who are you? What fucking planet did you fall out of that you make movies like this? So Dr. Bloodbath is about an abortion doctor who kills his patients. He'll call them up and say, oh, there were some bad results from your test. And they'll go, what test? And they go, the test we took after we did the procedure. Can I come in? And then they'll let him into their home, and then he'll kill them. And then it happens again and again and again and again. It's like absolutely identical setup every time. The appeal of this movie is there is a droning, repetitive, hypnotic thing that, for me, as a fan of slasher movies, all slasher movies are kind of hypnotic, but this is like stretched so far that it becomes an art film, where you're watching something and you just like, you kind of, your brain is flying everywhere but what's in front of you. Like, I sincerely have the same effect when watching certain later Tarkovsky films. This is a movie that doesn't have a lot of music. A lot of these films, they were shot with onboard microphones, which means instead of having external sound equipment, they just use the microphone that's built into the camcorder. And you get used to a certain droning sound in shot-on-video horror movies because they're using non-professional sound equipment. And each movie has a slightly different droning sound. It kind of actually reminds me of, if you watch horror movies from the early 30s, like from the talkies period, like The Mummy or Dracula or Frankenstein, there is not a lot of music in those movies either because they didn't quite figure out sound editing, and they didn't quite figure out what the audience would accept as far as music playing under dramatic scenes. Because you go to a play, you never hear music playing under dramatic scenes. So It was just sort of, it didn't occur to them to do it. So you just, and because the sound equipment was so primitive, you would just hear this weird droning ambient crackle under all these scenes. And when you watch enough of those early 30s horror movies, that crackle itself has an ominous feeling to it. And it creates this kind of atmosphere. And I think the specific ambient room tone of Dr. Bloodbath had the same thing for me, where it had the specific sound of like a spaceship in a sci-fi show, like the sort of just idling starship engine that you would hear in a Star Trek or something like that, a Next Generation specifically. And everyone in it acts like aliens, like they don't act like human beings. Everyone talks very slow, and they speak sentences as if they've never spoken English before and they've learned them phonetically. Even though these are American films with American actors. And when people get stabbed, they get stabbed like 60 to 70 times. It just keeps cutting to the same shot over and over again. And it's not a emphatic stabbing motion. It's not a realistic stabbing motion. It is like a pantomime, like someone is in a trance and they've been saying, and now you're stabbing them. And they're just like clearly not touching anything. Their arms just moving up and down rhythmically, and it just goes on and on and on. And the overall effect, I'm just like in a trance. It's unbelievable, this movie. There's a scene with an abortion where he does an abortion, and you see like in his mind he's stabbing this like little baby doll, and it's the exact same thing. So it's like, yeah, this is a pro-life movie, or whoever made this movie was probably pro-life. Consider, abortion doctor is a murderer, and now he's just taking his murders elsewhere, is the worldview of this film. And then at the end of this movie, so the whole movie is like, wow, Nothing is happening, but I'm just vibing out to how fucking alien everything is. At the very end of this movie, there's a subplot where his wife's cheating on him that, like, she reveals it and he kills her. At the very end of this movie, this doctor goes and he sits on a couch and he just sort of makes these weird motions with his hands. And it just goes on, and I couldn't figure out what he was doing or simulating or what it was in reference to or anything. And it honestly was like moving, and I don't know why. I have no reason to think this, but like I was watching it and I was like almost tearing up watching. It was like, you know, where he was. Like if you told me that the way he makes movies is he actually hypnotizes people the way that Herzog did for that Heart of Glass movie.
I was trying to remember. It was Herzog. That's right. I was trying to remember.
I think the movie was Heart of Glass, where he hypnotized all of his actors. Like, if you told me that's how this movie was made, it would put a lot of things into focus. But I don't think that's the case. And he, you know, it ends with him calling the police and saying, "I'm the one who's been killing all these people. Come and get me." And then he just comes and sits on a couch, and there's just a long, uninterrupted shot where he doesn't know what to do with his hands. He's doing these grabbing motions, and it's like he can't reckon with what he did, and it's unbelievable. It is so strange, and it is so captivating. And in the context of the rest of the movie, I thought it was just jaw-dropping. I loved it. I love this movie. It's the movie that I would never recommend to another human being. Except that it's on YouTube, and it's short. It's 70 minutes. And if you think that you are the kind of person who can open your heart to a killer abortion doctor movie the way you would open your heart, because I mean, like, I bring up Tarkovsky not as just like a shorthand for slow cinema or hypnotic cinema, but I bring up Tarkovsky because specifically Tarkovsky is a filmmaker who I like to love most of his films, and I don't understand nearly any of them. And there are people, I'm sure, who can watch Stalker and can parse the dialogue and can go like, yes, this movie is brilliant because of A, B, and C. But like, I'm just not that guy. I'm not an intellectual. So I love Stalker, but there's whole sections of the movie that make no sense to me whatsoever. So the idea of just sort of suspending my desire to understand why something is happening and just vibing with it is something I already do for highbrow movies like that, or nostalgia, other Tarkovsky movies. There's moments in Solaris where I don't know what the hell's going on. And so, like, to me, as long as you can sort of separate yourself from the, no, this is good, and this is bad, and this is to be made fun of, and this is to be, you know, worshipped.
Revealed.
Yeah, if you can sort of eliminate that in your mind and watch this movie, you might find that it has a similar effect for you. I don't know, but Dr. Bloodbath, I want to see everything else Nick Miller made now. And apparently they're all like this, so I just can't wait.
Let's speak.
Yeah, the next movie is Death Nurse from 1987, also by Nick Millard. It's more Millard madness. It's got a nurse played by Priscilla Alden, who also played Fat Ethel, killing patients to receive insurance money, and there's a lot of recycled footage from Criminally Insane. So again, another movie that has a bunch of shot on celluloid footage in it.
The descriptions of these Priscilla Alden, Nick Millard movies all sound like they could be descriptions of Andy Milligan movies. This kind of stuff he makes movies about. But
Andy Milligan movies are inept, but Andy Milligan movies are very human.
Yeah.
Or at least the two I've seen. I've seen Guru the Mad Monk and I've seen Fleshpot on 42nd Street, and they both feel like they're heightened and they're very melodramatic, but they're very human, and he has a way with dialogue, and there's a certain sophistication to them, despite in other ways them being like totally inept. Whereas Nick Millard feels like this is a movie made by someone who has not interacted with other human beings. Like, genuinely, if you told me Nick Millard, he had some sort of developmental disability or some sort of mental illness or some sort of something like that, and I think you know, I'm not an intellectual. I did not go to an art school or anything like that. I've not had these discussions that I think probably a lot of people who have had on like outsider artists and things of this nature. I personally try to just be empathetic, and I try not to classify people as outsider artists because I think that's very limiting, and kind of denies their ability. It denies the work that they put into it because it's saying that they're not responsible for it or whatever. So I try not to do that, but there are movies in this list, like the Nick Miller movie, like Alien Beast by Carl Suknick, where if I try to discourage this impulse, but I do get the impulse to wonder what is the situation from the person who made it. In the case of Dr. Bloodbath, I was able to enjoy the movie despite not knowing that. In the case of Alien Beasts, which we'll be talking about a little later, I was not.
No. Yeah.
But
I
sorry,
should say Death Nurse, along with some of the David Pryor movies, was put out, I believe, on Blu-ray from Olive. They tried to start this thing that they were calling Slasher Video, and it only really ever had one round. But Death Nurse, probably part of the reason we can't find it online is because that one has an actual copyright claim on it now.
Oh, good for them. The thing about Olive is Olive never ever puts any effort into anything outside of the movie itself. Like, they don't even do subtitles, and like that's the thing that gets horror fans excited about horror movies.
Yeah,
about these releases is that there's a commentary and interviews and this and that.
I'm trying to remember. I think some of the slasher ones had commentaries.
Oh, they did?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, but it was like an imprint that just didn't work out for whatever reason.
Next, speaking of films made by unique artists who you might be you might want to call outsider artists. Another Chester Novell Turner joint, the guy who did Black Devil Doll from Hell, which we talked about previously. Tales from the Quadead Zone. If you want to get the taste of Chester Novell Turner, if you want to just sort of luxuriate in bad feelings and sadness, but still that weird sense of humor and that sense of absurdity and the super minimalist music and everything, Tales from the Quadead Zone is where you should go, because it's not as upsetting as Black Devil Doll from Hell. But it's still, you watch it and you're just like, oh, I feel terrible. It's an anthology film. The lead actor from Black Devil Doll from Hell, I forget her name, but she is also the sort of lead in this, in that she is a wraparound segment. She has a child who is a ghost, or she does have a child that's a ghost, because you see it moving physical objects in the world, and there's some pretty good special effects where, like, he sits down on a chair and you see the imprint and you're like, oh wow, that looks good, you pulled it off, Chester. She is like, what, you want me to read you a story? What do you want me to read? And then she picks up a book, and then it turns into this like ominous leather tome called Tales from the Quadead Zone. What Quadead Zone, like what that phrase means, I have no idea, and it's not explained or explored at all in the movie. It's a really good title, but I don't know what it means. And it is 2 stories, and then the sort of wraparound device becomes the 3rd story. So the first story, its story is generous. What these are is a situation that is just drawn out. It is just a bad situation that there's no developments, there's no character arcs or anything. So like the first story is this family is at a table and they're saying grace, and the grandfather, part of his grace is saying that they don't have enough food but they're still happy. And then one day his grandson snaps and murders a bunch of people at the table, and then he makes the grandfather say grace again, and this time there's enough food. And it's like there's nothing to it. It's like a nothing story. It does have a weird bit of humor at the end where it does like little titles on screen that says what all the people who survived are up to. And one of them is like living high on the hog in witness protection, which I think is really funny. Just like a weird, like it's like the most traumatizing thing that ever happens to you. You get whisked away witness protection. Describing it as high on the hog is really funny to me. So like, I think that there is a sense of humor to Chester Novell Turner. I think he knows what he's doing. And that's what makes me think that Black Devil Doll from Hell is like intentionally a satire of some sort, despite the fact that it takes its premise very seriously. Second story, a younger brother hates his older brother. His older brother always got the upper hand throughout his life, but now his older brother's dead. So he steals his body from the mortuary and dresses him up as a clown. And that's the full prank as far as I can tell. He's not going to do anything with the body. He's just like, now your body's in my living room and you're dressed like a clown. Shows you. And then the brother's ghost, in as portrayed by these really cool, very creepy video effects, comes and then murders the younger brother. That is another movie that's just like, that's another short that's like, there's not really much of a plot here, but there is a funny scene where the grave robbers all are like having a celebratory toast, and one of them's like, "Hold on, I gotta get my good mug," and he gets he's like a ceramic mug that's just shaped giant titty, and they just pour champagne into it. They're just drinking champagne out of this giant titty. I think that was really funny. So like, there's a really offbeat sense of humor here, and then the final story is after she's done reading these stories from the Tales of the Quadead Zone, her abusive husband comes home, and he's like, "I can't believe you're still talking to him. You know he's not there. You know he's dead." And she's like, "No, he's here. He's a ghost." And he starts beating her, and then she murders him. And then the cops come, and they're about to arrest her, and she goes, "Can I go change into something more comfortable?" And they go, "Okay." And then she goes upstairs to a bathroom and slits her wrist. And then it shows images of her, presumably in heaven, but it just looks like someone's backyard, like playing with her son. And that's the movie ends. So
that's pretty bleak.
Yeah,
that's pretty
it's
bleak.
It's a bleak movie. It's like nothing but bad feelings, except it has that weird sense of humor to it, and it has that really rugged ass score, and that's just super repetitive, and it's a singular thing. Tales from the Quadead Zone, also on YouTube, and I would say probably an easier place to start with Chester Novel Turner than Black Devil Doll from Hell, even though the latter is definitely the more well-known one. Next, we have The Newly Dead from 1987, directed by Joseph Murray. It's this one has a DVD release by Troma, but it's like a Troma Team pickup. I don't think it's a...
Right, yeah, it wasn't in-house.
Because I don't think Troma ever did anything in-house on video until like the 21st century. I think they hated... I think specifically Lloyd Kaufman hated videotape, even though he distributed so many of these movies.
Right.
So The Newly Deads is a trans woman is about to hook up with a motel owner, and then he discovers that she's a trans woman, so he murders her. And then she comes back 20 years later and starts killing guests at the motel. It's really only notable because Joseph Murray is a sort of a cult filmmaker, probably best known for his direct-to-video 90s action movies. He made movies like Rage, The Sweeper, and Repo Jake. He makes these very unhinged, just high-powered, absolutely nuts kind of action movies that went direct-to-video. I think they're probably shot on video as well, but I don't know for sure. But he also made this and one other horror film. I think that's also on the list. Next, we have Venus Flytrap from 1987, directed by T. Michael. I don't know why.
Good old T.
Yeah. So this is a movie that has a neither of us have seen it, but this is a movie that has a reputation of being like a little more interesting and with more depth than you might expect. It's punks invading an affluent family, and it's just like this really nasty kind of sadism, torture kind of a movie, these kind of hostage movies that exist. Except there's like a twist ending where the family are actual serial killers, and it's all shot on video, and it turns out that it was shot on video by someone holding a camera the whole time or whatever, and they address the camera at the end. I don't know. It sounds like a pretty weird movie, but it has a good following, and it's got apparently good punks in it.
Yeah, it's Massacre Video put this one and Sledgehammer out on DVD. So I think the reason we couldn't find this one online is, again, somebody has a copyright claim on it. But yeah, it seems to still be in print. I just haven't had a chance to see it.
And then that brings us to Splatter Farm. Once again, we join our good boys of Mark Polonia, John Polonia, and Todd Smith. Once again, the actors, writers, and directors of this film. I love this movie, but I want to hear what you think of this movie.
This was the first thing I watched, and I probably shouldn't have watched it first. Um, it so I didn't do any research when I wrote my notes, just because I kind of wanted to have my ideas in head. But I was saying I was guessing it was made by literal children, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and that they were making it because they understood gore effects and wanted to make a thing about it, and they had access to
Check.
someone's hobby farm,
Check.
like probably some relative.
Yeah.
And then it took me an astonishingly long time to realize that the Polinas were brothers, and I thought at first that it was one guy for some reason filming two sides of a conversation with himself.
Even though there are clearly shots of where they're both in the frame at
But
the
the
same
thing
time.
is they're not both in frame for a lot of the movie because they're filming each other. I finally figured out they're filming
Oh.
each other. And so it wasn't until they get around the dinner table that both of them were in a shot together. And I went, oh, shit. Well, that was like the most impressive thing about the movie to me is like, why did he decide to play two characters? So I was very confused. But it was, it definitely is based around gore effects, and it's a lot of naps again. People fall asleep in their movies really easily. It's like as soon as nothing's happening, somebody says, "I'm going to go lay down," and has a nap.
Well, I mean, almost none of the filmmakers in on this list are particularly gifted storytellers. But I feel like the Polonias specifically are just like they literally can't even come up with something that all the characters would do. The idea is that like these are two brothers who are men, who are full-grown ass men who are not. They're 16. The idea is they're like, man, we just need to get away. We just need to clear our heads. But like that is a premise they understand, but not anything beyond that. So like as soon as they get there, they're like, God damn it, why are we at this farm? It's so boring. So it's just like, oh, what do we do? But of course, they're the Polonians and they have those weird ass voices. Like, what are we gonna do? It's stupid here.
They like they
They
sound
instantly
like
start whining.
they sound like those terrible impressions people used to do of Napoleon Dynamite. That's
Yes,
like
yeah, yeah,
their
yeah,
normal
yeah, yeah.
tone. It's not. They don't sound like Napoleon Dynamite. They sound like someone's impression of a Napoleon Dynamite.
Mm-hmm. And they have that sort of petulant childishness that
They whine
Napoleon
about
Dynamite has.
everything
Yeah,
for the first
everything.
however long.
But what they don't realize is that the local farmhand, played by Todd Smith, who in this movie is just shot like he is like a glamorous film star, like he is, and maybe it's just because he is contrasted by the just whiniest dweebs like ever. But like Todd Smith in this movie is just like every time he's like looking at the camera, he's making eyes at it almost like he's very sexy in a way that's just like
But
weird
he's
for me to
supposed
say.
to be
'Cause
revolting, and
I think he's a teenager, so it's weird for me to say
yeah,
that. But like that's just the way he is shot by the camera.
yeah,
And like, but yeah, he is supposed to be like the weird. All these kinds of movies going back to the 40s, they would, or even before that, they would have like the assistant or the weird mute farmhand who's like deformed in some way. Or a lot of Hammer movies would have this stock character of like the person who is mentally feeble but
hmm
sees everything that's happening, um, and he is that, but they don't realize that he has just been murdering people. Gore effects so repulsive in this movie.
yeah. Even when they're not convincing, they're so gross that
In
it doesn't
in
matter.
hallucinations, it's like you watch it and you go like, oh man, those kids sure are inventive. They sure did come up with a lot of good ideas. In this one, it is more like Fulci. It is more just like, oh god, this is upsetting me. This is like I'm re-examining how I look at human bodies, just the way that you are just smashing this guy's face.
Yeah,
And so the other thing we need to talk about this movie that probably applies to other movies that we've seen and talked about already, but I just happen to know specifically is true of this movie, is that this is a 2-hour movie that when it was released on DVD, Mark Polonia went back and re-edited it and cut it down to a more manageable, reasonable length of 80 minutes. And a lot of these movies, when they got DVD releases, got re-edited. They got retouched up. There's like suddenly have all of these, tools at their disposal they didn't before.
hmm
And I think a lot of these filmmakers just sort of consider that part of the remastering process. It's just going through and it's like, well, do we really need this scene where people stand around and nothing happens? No. I think there was original cut of Black Devil Doll from Hell was like an extra 20, 25 minutes. That was mostly just the main character, like walking to and from church and stuff. So this is a movie that I've not seen the original version as it existed on tape. I've seen the coming at it with fresh eyes, having learned a lot since I was 16, Mark Polonia cut. And I think that applies to some of the music too. I can't quite tell, but it sounds like some of the music is not
it's better music than the music in Hallucinations.
Yeah.
And it was only made a year later, so that seems like a good guess.
So there's this other thing, again, like Hallucinations, there's this sort of running theme of like the brothers are afraid they're going to be separated. In this case, they're afraid that the aunt is going to molest one of them. Like that's the Polonias are they just like doing things in bad taste. They just like being offensive because they're just shitty teenagers. And like there's something endearing about that because they have, like, when you see a producer of a major film make a movie that you consider morally reprehensible, you look at it and you're like, oh my gosh, this person thinks this, and they were in charge of all these people, and that one naked woman in it, you know, like, she was probably one of 30 naked women that auditioned, and who knows how they felt in that audition with that guy, and like the whole thing just starts to feel scuzzy, and it's hard to... This movie is offensive in a way that you're just like, oh, you dorks. Like, I could fucking...
Yeah.
Like the only people who get naked are the Polonias, so no one's getting exploited. Yeah. It's just, like... And it's just, like, it's hard to be offended because even though they are, even though they're ostensibly, one can assume they are not actually survivors of sexual abuse or incest or whatever, like... They just seem like they have no power and whatever they do is punching up automatically.
Yeah.
I don't know. That could be me being apologetic for it. But I like that this movie is able to be just in such bad taste without pushing me away in the way a lot of other similar movies are. And so there's a lot of that with like the aunt and...
This elderly woman who's clearly not an actor and probably their actual aunt.
Which makes it even weirder because she's like coming onto them.
And she agrees to do all this. Like she doesn't... There's even a sex scene that is under the covers, but I'm trying to remember if you can tell it's actually her.
I'm pretty sure that there's like moments where you are seeing a POV of one character. And it's like she's looming over him or whatever. And then you see under the sheets, and it's clearly either one or two of the Polonias just under the sheets making weird little motions or whatever. I don't think that...
But so she did, but she agreed to imply this.
I cannot imagine talking anyone in my family. They all love me very much, and none of them would ever do this scene because it's gross. They would say like, "What is wrong with you? What, like, seriously, get help." But the Polonias, they get indulged. I also can't imagine my parents buying me a Herschel Gordon Lewis book, but like whatever. God bless them. So this is a movie that, because it is 80 minutes long instead of 2 hours, I think the pacing is very good. There's almost every scene has something weird or gross happening in it.
Yeah.
There's one of the brothers witnesses a murder, and he tells the other one, and the other one's incredulous. And I think there's more nightmare sequences like Hallucinations. In fact, apparently, someone who is friends with the Polonias followed me on Letterboxd after I started doing all these reviews. And he told me that the shitting of the knife scene in Hallucinations was in an early cut of Splatter Farm because they made Hallucinations first, but they didn't release it until after Splatter Farm. So when they were initially doing Splatter Farm, they were like, oh, well, we already did that in that other movie that no one saw. Why don't we just put that clip in here, and that'll be his dream sequence. So there's a couple... It has that same kind of structure where you can just sort of cut and paste these weird-ass gore scenes. Eventually, one believes the other. They have a fun rapport. I do like watching them together. They seem to just really vibe on each other's humor in a way that I find very pleasant. Of course, they're brothers, so it's like, of course, That makes sense.
And they created this whole thing together. So
Right.
they're already
So
on the same wavelength.
yeah, so it's just they feel like a well-oiled machine in a way that just makes everything work and makes a movie that should have no emotional stakes have some emotional stakes. And then Todd Smith, who plays the sexy farmhand, just so sexy. No, okay, I'll stop saying that. I'm kidding. But like he tortures one of the brothers in a sequence that just has this one droning music scores on and on and on, and the sequence goes on, and he gets shit smeared on his face, he gets peed on, like it's so like just so gross, but because the movie the creation of the movie feels so goofy, it exists in this weird nether zone where it's like kind of upsetting because you're seeing this like boy get his like pants pulled down and stuff. You're just like, oh, what like what am I watching? This is so messed up, but also it's so goofy and weird that it kind of overrides that sense of your brain. I don't know. There's a specific thing that the Polonias do in Hallucinations and especially in Splatter Farm that I just think is totally fascinating and wonderful. So that whole sequence happens. I think ultimately both the brothers get killed, and then the aunt reveals that Todd Smith was in fact her son and was a product of incest. And then it ends on like a weird, gross out Bugs Bunny sort of a thing where he lights dynamite, just shoves it up her, and she explodes, and that's the end of the movie.
Yeah, well, there's the body. That's right. The aunt definitely has scenes where she has to like caress a very rotten body that's later implied to be her.
Yeah,
said
yeah.
To be her ex.
Oh, that's
so yeah,
so gross too.
She was participating with shit, and it's weird. It's weird.
I mean, it might not be an aunt. It might just be some other old lady they know.
But oh god, still, it's so weird.
It's so weird. This movie is so special. I love it. I love Splatter Farm so much. I want to see more Polonia. For me, like Polonia is the discovery that in a way that I'm not necessarily interested in the Donald Farmer movies or and everything like that. I think the Polonias are a very specific group and they work on a very specific wavelength, and their presence in the movies themselves is so disarming. I'm trying to think of something comparable, and I just really don't think there's anything else like it in any movie I've ever seen, of like filmmakers appearing on screen in a way that totally recontextual. Like if you saw this movie and it was two actual adults and everything else was the exact same, like you would not like it would be so you would not be fascinating.
No.
You would watch it and you'd be like, that was kind of a crummy movie. The gore effects were good and it had a weird sense of humor, but like they put themselves in their movies in a way that makes the movies act as if they're documentaries of the movies you're watching. You know what I mean? Like if you watch when sometimes you'll see like a Be Kind Rewind or something like that, or an episode of Home Movies, the Adult Swim show.
Right.
And you'll see the movie inside of it, and you'll see the characters break character, and then you'll see like, oh, this thing they're doing in this little fictional thing they're doing, it spells, it connects to their larger character arc in the episode. And that's not something you see in actual movies, because that's just not how actual movies are shot or produced or made, and there's just not those neat dramas that come to a climax within a scene in a movie. But that happens in Polonia movies. You watch them and you're like, this is the story of the Polonia brothers. It's a totally through a fucked up lens, but like I am witnessing their real brotherly relationship, and the fact that one of them is no longer alive just makes it like that much more moving. And
yeah,
I just got to see these Polonia movies.
Did you see One Shot of the Dead?
I did not.
Japanese movie. See, it's so easy to spoil for you, but I think you'd really like it based on what you just said about home.
Okay, I started watching it, and I don't think I got to the point. Like, I know it's a film crew that's making a zombie movie, and then a zombie outbreak happens, or something along those lines. And I didn't even get to that part. I just wasn't in the right mood.
Basically, basically after 40 minutes or so, then it becomes a very different
I
movie.
see. Okay, so that's where I need to get to. I will watch it at
Yeah.
some point. I think someone it might have even been assigned to me. At any rate,
It's on Shudder, so
yeah, I'll watch it. But the Polonia Brothers are very special filmmakers, and they seem like dirtbags. They seem like if I had to spend 5 minutes with 16-year-old Polonia Brothers, like I would be like, I need to get the fuck out of here. I cannot stand these two. But watching their movies is a very wonderful context to experience them.
You're heading down the wrong direction, my friend. You won't like what you will find in the end. You'd better pay more attention to those warnings in your head. Change your direction, or you may end up dead. They will draw you to the game with promises of gold. Escape from all your troubles